Beyond Barbarossa, Episode 92. On 27 January, in the middle of the afternoon, a reconnaissance patrol from the 107th Rifle Division emerged from a snowbound forest to discover the most terrible symbol in modern history. Just over a week before, 58,000 inmates deemed capable of walking were forced westwards from Auschwitz in front of the Red Army advance. Those who were to survive this death march, an experience which is probably worse than all the horrors they had suffered so far, found themselves dumped in other concentration camps, where squalor, starvation, and disease increased dramatically in the last 3 months of the war. Dr. Mengele seized all the notes from his experiments and left for Berlin. IG Farben executives destroyed their records at Auschwitz III. The gas chambers and crematoria at Birkenau were blown up. Orders were given to liquidate the prisoners too ill to move, but for some reason the SS killed only a couple of hundred out of the 8,000 left behind. They concentrated more on attempts to destroy the evidence, but there was more than enough left, including 368,820 men's suits, 836,255 women's coats and dresses, to say nothing of 7 tons of human hair. Welcome to Beyond Barbarossa, the first English-language podcast in the world to focus on the Eastern Front of World War II. This is episode 92, Into Germany. I'm Scott Burry, podcasting from the Redbeard Studio on traditional Anishinaabeg Algonquin land, also called Ottawa, capital of free, independent, and sovereign Canada. And I'm joined in the studio today by my 2 indispensable assistants, Ragnar the Magnificent Ragdoll and Daisy the Danger Doodle. Say hi, guys. Oh, they're both falling asleep. Anyway. You also may have noticed a new logo for the podcast. Gorgeous, isn't it? I have to thank my neighbor Chris for helping to create it, as well as some other visual aids for the podcast, which I'm hoping to bring to you fairly soon. Thanks, Chris. Last episode brought the podcast into the new year of 2026, and the story of the Eastern Front into the final year of the Second World War. Although I stress again, the people there at the time could not know that. Yes, there were definite signs that the German and Japanese military situations were hopeless. As their forces retreated across huge distances, their allies turned away from them, and their military production and recruitment fell further and further behind their losses every month. But in Europe, Nazi Führer leader Adolf Hitler clung irrationally to his faith in German superiority and his hope to stop the Allied advance on the Western Front with a separate peace, which would allow him to turn his forces eastward and defeat the Soviet advance from that direction. History would not oblige him. But again, nobody at the time could know for sure what would happen. We left off last episode in mid-January 1945, with Soviet forces conducting simultaneous operations near the Baltic coast in the north, sweeping across Poland south of there, besieging Budapest, Hungary, and pushing west to the Lake Balaton region, the Nazis' last source of petroleum. With heavy casualties on both the German and Soviet sides, the Red Army pushed not really steadily, but almost continuously westward. And farther south, the Third Ukrainian Front was still fighting in Yugoslavia. That's just to give you an idea of the size, the number of resources that the USSR could bring to bear at this point in the Second World War. Meanwhile, on the Western Front, Hitler had ordered a last offensive operation in the Ardennes Forest in Belgium and France. This became known as the Battle of the Bulge. By 17 January, the Americans announced the end of the battle with their own success. They won. Although the fighting there did continue for another 3 weeks. This episode, number 92, called Into Germany, is going to continue describing the main Soviet operations happening in the winter of 1945. Those are the Baltic Offensive and the Vistula Oder Offensive. This time, though, I'm going to do it a little bit differently than I did, well, very differently than I did last episode, where I attempted to describe the whole Eastern Front absolutely chronologically, day by day. That meant that at one point, one paragraph, I'd be talking about East Prussia, the next about Budapest, the next about East Prussia again, then about Poland. So it's like we were zipping north and south a lot. This time I'm going to focus on each area one at a time, because remember, all these operations are happening simultaneously. It's a lot. Before we do that, though, of course, we have to look at what else is happening in the war. January 20, as mentioned last episode, Franklin Delano Roosevelt was sworn in as President of the United States of America for the 4th consecutive time, something that the current holder of that office has no hope of ever matching. Roosevelt's vice president this time around was Harry S. Truman. 25th January, the U.S. Navy bombards Iwo Jima, a volcanic island 1,200 kilometers or 750 miles south of Tokyo. 28th January, U.S. forces begin a second invasion of the island of Luzon in the Philippines, and UK and Commonwealth forces complete the linking of the Lido Road in India with the Burma Road, allowing supplies to flow to the Chinese opponents of Japan in China. 30 January, UK Prime Minister Winston Churchill meets with the Western Allies' combined chiefs of staff on Malta in the Mediterranean to plan the end of the war in both Europe and the Pacific. US President Roosevelt joins the meeting on 2nd February. So that's the overall situation on the Western Front and in the Pacific of the Second World War. Now let's get to the focus of this podcast, the Eastern Front. I'll start with East Prussia. We left it last episode with the Third Belarusian Front under Ivan Chernyhovsky attacking westward toward Konigsberg, the ancient East Prussian fortified capital. By 19 January, what remained of the 3rd Panzer Army had holed up behind the city's walls or into the peninsula of Samland, immediately west of the city. See Map 1 on the webpage for this episode. Meanwhile, our old friend Rocky Rokossovsky, his name was Konstantin actually, Rocky Rokossovsky had led the 2nd Belarusian Front to the Vistula Lagoon, where the Vistula River empties into the Baltic Sea west of Konigsberg, trapping the German 4th Army as well as some of the 2nd Army, effectively encircling Konigsberg from the west. And northeast of the city, The First Baltic Front, under Hovhan Bagramian, entered the city of Memel, now Klaipėda, Lithuania. The German forces trapped in that pocket since the previous October completely withdrew by sea on 27 January. The remnants of the Großdeutschland Division, the 58th Division, and the 7th Panzer Division were evacuated by sea, covered by the German heavy cruisers Prinzjugend and Lützow. The commanders of the 3rd Panzer Army and the 4th Army, Georg Hans Reinhardt and Friedrich Hossbach, respectively, were fired. In Hossbach's case, only 2 days after being given command. Some of the surviving 3rd Panzer Army units withdrew into the Samland Peninsula, that thumb of land just north of Konigsberg, protruding west into the Baltic Sea. You can get a better idea by looking at map 2 on the webpage for this episode. As you can tell, that did not give them much room to escape nor even to breathe. 15 divisions of the 4th Army moved west-southwest and became trapped at the Vistula Lagoon. This became known as a Heiligenbill pocket, where they clung on for another 2 miserable months, which left some 60,000 soldiers of the 3rd Panzer Army, now under the command of the 4th Army. There never seems to be a problem for some staff officer to move boxes on an organizational chart, as opposed to doing something actually useful, does there? So there's 60,000 soldiers of the 3rd Panzer Army plus 200,000 civilians left in the city of Konigsberg itself. And they weren't getting resupplies. Rations were cut to 180 grams of bread per day for both civilians and soldiers. This is about 4 slices of bread from a standard North American sliced loaf. That's what you have to live on. This prompted people to try to escape. As you can imagine, about 2,000 women and children walked over the frozen strait to the port of Pilau, now Baltisk, Kaliningrad, at the northern tip of the Vistula Spit, a distance over the ice of about 30 kilometers or 20 miles. By late January, about 450,000 civilians had gotten across the frozen Vistula Lagoon to areas still occupied by German forces. On 28 January, the Germans began evacuating that little port of Pilau by sea. But on the 29th, the Red Army attacked and overran the main evacuation route from Konigsberg to Pilau, so preventing any further escapes of civilians. It took the Germans until 19th February, 3 weeks of hard fighting, to reopen that corridor. Even so, the German garrison in Konigsberg continued to hold on with no thought of surrender to the communists. The Germans were retreating as fast as they could, abandoning large areas. The German civilians had been told that the advancing Russians were subhuman monsters. And granted, mass murder and rape were standard practice once the Red Army got onto German soil. So the ethnic Germans, in anticipation of the Red Tide, fled with whatever they could carry. But then there are other people who say, well, it was overblown. So I'm just going to tell you something from the point of view of a person who was there, a man in the Red Army in the Baltics and East Prussia in 1945, my father-in-law, Morris Bury, who told me that when they were in the Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, the officers told them, hands off the women. But once they crossed onto German territory, it was do what you want, boys. Just to stress this a little bit more, I'm going to read to you an excerpt from the 3rd volume of my Eastern Front trilogy, Walking Out of War, which is where I wrote down Morris's true story. Quote, Morris found Commissar Sorkin in the group. They reached the town's central square. Black smoke poured out of the town hall's windows. At the corner of the square, a shop's door lay on the ground among the glass shards of its shattered front window. Morris saw 3 Red Army soldiers, privates, standing inside as the bare ass of a 4th man rose and fell between the spread legs of a woman on the floor. She didn't even scream, just whimpered. Morris saw the man on the ground rise, and another got down to take his turn. Commissar Sorkin looked into the shop too, and walked faster. After what the Germans did to us, what can you expect? He said, and walked on. Antony Beevor describes some of the situation in his comprehensive history, the Second World War. Quote, refugees from the capital of Konigsberg thought that they had escaped safely by train, but when they reached Allenstein, they were pulled from the carriages by soldiers from the 3rd Guards Cavalry, delighted to find such a source of plunder and women. Most of those attempting to flee by road were overtaken by Soviet troops. Some were simply crushed in their carts under the tracks of Soviet tanks. Others suffered an even worse fate. A tough note to end this section on. But now I'm going to move south to the next major operation happening at the same time, to the Vistula Oder Offensive, after this short break. This episode is brought to you by the Eastern Front Trilogy, the true story of a Canadian man, Maurice Bury, drafted into the Soviet Red Army in 1941, just in time to be thrown between the jaws of the USSR and Nazi Germany at the launch of the greatest land invasion in history, the monstrous war called Operation Barbarossa. It comes in 3 volumes, Army of Worn Souls, Under the Nazi Heel, and Walking Out of War. The Eastern Front Trilogy is the story of the largest and deadliest side of the Second World War, seen through the eyes of a man who was there from the earliest days in 1941, through Germany's grinding occupation of Ukraine, and finally to the savage end of the war in Berlin. You can find 3 individual volumes as ebooks exclusively on Amazon, or purchase the 3-volume complete paperback on any online book retailer or at your local bookstore. To learn more about the Eastern Front Trilogy, visit scottburyauthor.com.
Did you know that the cappuccino was invented by a Ukrainian? Or that many first names, like Philip and Agatha, were brought to Western Europe by Ukrainian princesses? Or that a Ukrainian was the first female given the rank of officer in a modern army? Well, if you didn't, and even if you did, you can learn more about my podcast, Wandering the Edge, a podcast about Ukrainian history with a spot of travel, and all in English. And if you like Beyond Barbarossa as much as I do, because, well, it makes my life a whole lot easier since I don't have to do any episodes deep diving into the Eastern Front of the Second World War, please take a listen to Wandering the Edge for a deep dive into Ukrainian history, culture, and traditions. Find out more on wanderingtheedge.net. And now let's get back to Scott exploring and explaining the Eastern Front of the Second World War.
Welcome back to part 2 of episode 92 of Beyond Barbarossa, into Germany. As described last episode, the Red 47th and 61st Armies and the Polish First Army, also known as Berling's Army, which was under Moscow's control, entered the destroyed Warsaw on 17 January, the ruins left by the Germans after the Red Army let them have their way since the Warsaw Rising in August. The garrison abandoned the city as the Red Army entered it. This, of course, did not make Hitler happy. He had declared Warsaw to be a Festung, a fortress city, to be defended to the end, the death of the last German soldier. Just as he had with Demyansk and Stalingrad in 1942, Smolensk in 1943, Sevastopol, Bobroysk, Courland, and Vilnius in 1944, and at several other cities on the Western Front as well. It didn't work in those cases, by which I mean the strategy did not prevent the Red Army or the Allies from ultimately capturing the fortified city. All this approach accomplished was shockingly high casualties on both sides, the destruction of the city in question, and ultimately the loss of German forces that might have been better used elsewhere. Or maybe not. Ultimately, the Germans would lose, but that's the fallacy of hindsight again. As I said, in January 1945, no one could be sure what the outcome would be, when exactly the war would end, not even whether they personally might be alive the next day. Even though the Festung tactic never worked, that didn't prevent Hitler from ordering them. On 16 January 1945, the chief of the operational branch of the German Army General Staff, Colonel Bogislaw von Bohnen, that's a curious combination of a Polish first name with a German family name, but anyway, he gave Army Group A permission to withdraw from Warsaw. This overrode Hitler's Festung order. Hitler had Colonel von Bohnen arrested, and he wound up in the Dachau concentration camp until liberation by the U.S. Army in May 1945. While the three armies were busy in Warsaw, the rest of Marshal Georgy Zhukov's First Belarusian Front, or group of armies, pushed past the Polish capital, heading for the Oder River and Germany itself. The 2nd Guards Tank Army and the 5th Shock Army reached the river by the end of the month, and one unit of the 5th Shock Army actually crossed over the frozen river and captured the town of Kienitz, now called Leschen, on the 31st. But again, let's not get ahead of the story. As those two armies raced to the Oder River, today's border between Germany and Poland, the 8th Guards Army captured the city of Lodz, south of them, on 19 January. On the 25th, the 1st Guards Tank Army encircled Poznan, 200 kilometers or 120 miles west of there. This began a month-long intense siege because, again, Hitler had declared Poznan a Festung, or fortified city, to be defended without retreat at all costs. But as had happened at Warsaw, most of the Red Army forces swept past the city of Poznan, leaving the 1st Guards Tank Army and the 8th Guards Army to besiege and reduce its fortifications. It was important as a rail hub, but also a city on the main route from Warsaw to Berlin. So it's understandable that Hitler and the Germans wanted to hold on to it. But I think the generals, especially the other senior officers in the field, felt, well, not at all costs. Now, in Poznan, the Germans had anywhere from 15,000 to 60,000 soldiers. The sources are, inconsistent on that point. And I guess this is an illustration of the idea of the fog of war. But they had a sizable contingent there, and there was a 19th century citadel or fortress at the top of a hill in the middle of the city. And in addition, around the city were 18 massive forts with heavy weapons to defend against modern armies. So sort of an outer ring of defenses, then the city inside that, and at the very center of the city, this 19th century fortress or citadel. The 8th Guards Army, one of the armies besieging Poznan, was commanded by General Vasily Chukov. You may remember him as the main defender and ultimate victor, the guy who stayed in Stalingrad through the battle there. Here's what he had to say about Poznan's encircling forts. Quote, underground structures, each with several stories, the whole projecting above the surrounding terrain. Only a mound was visible above ground, the layer of earth covering the rest. Each fort was ringed by a ditch 10 meters wide and 8 meters deep, with walls riveted with brickwork. Across the ditch was a bridge leading to one of the upper stories. Among the forts to the rear, there were one-story brick bunkers. These were clad in concrete almost a full meter thick and were used as stores. The upper works of the forts were sufficiently strong to provide reliable protection against heavy artillery fire. The enemy would be able to direct fire of all kinds against us, both on the approaches to the forts and within them, on the rampart. The embrasures were such that flanking fire from rifles and machine guns could be directed from them. End quote. Seems impregnable, but remember, by late January, these forts and the city with its citadel were surrounded. Most of the First Belarusian Front had bypassed the city, so it was cut off, and by 25th January, the 8th Guards Army began attacking the forts. On the 26th, the Red Army penetrated the ring of forts south of the city and began attacking them from inside the city itself. Still, it would take almost another month until 23rd February with a final assault on the central citadel that some historians compare to medieval warfare to complete the conquest of Poznan. As this fighting in Poznan was going on, Zhukov's First Belarusian Front was moving steadily west. The German army not only retreated, but civilians fled ahead of them in Poland, as they had in East Prussia. After the Red Army had discovered the Majdanek concentration camp in July 1944, when they took Lublin, Poland, and told the world about the horror they found, after that, the Nazis began forcing prisoners from other concentration camps from the eastern regions onto death marches ahead of the Red Army. The opening quote at the beginning of this episode was from Antony Beevor's book, The Second World War, describing some of this action. In total, the SS forced about 250,000 prisoners to walk hundreds of kilometers of wintry landscape. Thousands of both concentration camp victims and Allied POWs died. With Army Group Center surrounded in East Prussia, the Wehrmacht reorganized again, creating Army Group Vistula to defend the area between the rivers Vistula and Oder. This comprised the 9th Army, the 2nd Army, and the 11th SS Panzer Army. And to this were added the 5th SS Mountain Corps and 2 reserve infantry divisions. Just point out they were already there. This was just putting them together on an organizational chart and presumably under one centralized command. This organization could not hold the Red Army back. So they reorganized again. Well, actually, they just renamed the army groups again. So Army Group North, right, the group that was up in the Baltic states, trapped in pockets, became Army Group Courland. In total, fewer than 200,000 men. Army Group Center in Poland became Army Group North. Confusing, I know. The new Army Group North had fewer than 500,000 soldiers, facing over 1 million in the First Belarusian Front. Army Group A to the south became Army Group Center with 3 armies. Its numbers also less than half of what the Soviets were bringing to bear against them. So now let's move a bit farther south again. While the Red and Polish armies were taking Warsaw, Ivan Konev's First Ukrainian Front turned toward the city of Breslau in eastern Silesia, which was part of Poland that Germany had annexed in 1939. Now the city of Breslau is called Wrocław, and it's in Poland again. We'll get into the renaming of cities and the shifting of borders in this part of Europe in a future episode after the end of the war, because that's a critical part of the resolution of the Second World War. Konev's 59th and 60th armies moved on the German 17th Army, going through Krakow, the ancient Polish capital. The Germans abandoned the city, and the Red Army came into that without firing a shot. Next, the First Ukrainian Front was ordered to secure the industrial region of Upper Silesia. Again, that's a part of Poland that Germany annexed. Konev was told to get this area without destroying the very valuable factories in the area. This order would be more challenging. They were now west of the pre-war German border, and German troops were fighting on what they considered to be, however justifiable you find this, they said it was their home soil, and they fought fanatically. Konev sent the 59th and 60th Army straight westward, attacking the German 17th Army head-on, while the 21st Red Army looped northward to try to encircle them. In the meantime, a little farther north, what was left of the 4th Panzer Army tried to break out of their own encirclement. Most of its 42nd Corps was trapped and destroyed west of the town of Radom, south of Warsaw. The few who escaped met up with the 24th Panzer Corps and retreated farther west. They took advantage of heavy fog on 22nd January to reach the Warta River and join up with the Grossdeutschland Panzer Corps, which had been transferred from, if you remember, Courland, then crossed the Oder River into Germany, 220 miles or 350 kilometers east of where they'd been at the start of the year 3 weeks earlier. So here we are at the end of January, and we're going to have to move back north again and again work our way south. But let's do that after this short break. Hi, Scott here. I hope you enjoy this episode and that you get a lot out of the whole podcast. If you do like Beyond Barbarossa and you want to help me keep it going, please give it a rating and or a review on Apple Podcasts, Podbean, Amazon, or whichever platform you listen to it. That helps let other people know about it and find it more easily. Patreon's another way you can support the podcast, my research and podcasting expenses. All you have to do is go to patreon.com/beyondbarbarossa and sign up at whatever level of support you prefer. Patreon supporters get early, ad-free access to new episodes, as well as exclusive bonus episodes on topics like the Winter War with Finland and the pre-Barbarossa invasion of Poland by Nazi Germany and the USSR in 1939. Check it out, won't you? Patreon.com/beyondbarbarossa. Thanks.
As Scott elegantly describes in each episode of Beyond Barbarossa, the war on the Eastern Front was truly gargantuan, both in terms of its geography and its destructiveness. But given that there is so much territory to cover, and that so many millions of men were involved in the fighting, it's perhaps inevitable that some battles from the Eastern Front get overlooked. I'm David Sumner, and I'm the host of Europe at War, a weekly podcast exploring lesser-known battles and stories of the Second World War with a particular focus on the Eastern Front. From the drama of thousands of trapped German soldiers and terrified civilians attempting to break out of the Halbe pocket, to the unexpected and blistering counterattack launched by German forces on the Red Army during the Battle of Bautzen, many of the Eastern Front's most dramatic battles, particularly those which happened towards the end of the war, have long been neglected by historians, and their stories have remained untold until now. So to hear these incredible tales from the Eastern Front and more, check out Europe at War, available on all podcast platforms. Thank you. Now let's get back to the show.
Thanks for coming back to part 3 of episode 92 of Beyond Barbarossa, into Germany. As we get to the end of January, we're going to have to move back north again to East Prussia and then work our way south again. By 20 January 1945, the Red Army was driving the Germans west across East Prussia. Hitler's former East Prussian headquarters, the Wolfsschanze, loosely or commonly translated as the Wolf's Lair, but more strictly speaking more like the Wolf's Redoubt or the Wolf's Bunker. That location was only a few kilometers south of the Lithuanian East Prussian border. It was where Operation Valkyrie had taken place in July 1944, the failed attempt to kill Hitler with a briefcase bomb. Hitler survived, as you know, and left the complex for the last time on 20 November 1944. On the night of the 24th to 25th January 1945, as the Third Belarusian Front approached the site of the bunker, the order came to destroy it. The Germans used as much as 8,000 kilograms, or 9 tons, of TNT. But because of the large size of the buildings in this Wolfsschanze and the reinforcement of the construction, they were only partially destroyed. On 27 January, so 2 days after this destruction, this explosion, the 31st Red Army reached the remains of the Wolfsschanze, finding it abandoned. The Wolf's Lair, Hitler's Eastern Front headquarters, had not been completely destroyed by the retreating German forces. According to one report, it took 10 years to clear more than 54,000 landmines surrounding the complex. So that same day, the 27th January, as the Red Army reached Wolfsschanze, the Germans finished their withdrawal of civilians and military from Memel, which had been besieged since the previous October. The 28th Corps went south to the Samland Peninsula, now the Sambia Peninsula north and west of Konigsberg, to help the defense there. The surviving members of the 58th and 95th Infantry Divisions were pulled just a little bit farther back onto the Curonian Spit to act as rear guard for the retreat. So again, take a look at map 2 to get an idea of where these places are in relation to each other. The 27th of January 1945 was a big day on the Eastern Front. In addition to the day of completing the withdrawal from Memel and reaching the Wolfsschanze in East Prussia, a little farther south, the 27th was the day that the troops from the 322nd Rifle Division of the 60th Army, part of Ivan Konev's 1st Ukrainian Front, liberated the Auschwitz concentration camp complex in Upper Silesia, which, as I mentioned, was occupied Poland. Auschwitz was a complex comprising some 40 camps, including Birkenau, an extermination camp, and Monowitz, a labor camp operated by I.G. Farben. It's located in the town of Oswiecim in Poland, about 70 kilometers west of Krakow. It's now more or less a museum and a memorial. One of its most famous inmates or victims was Primo Levi, the famous Jewish-Italian journalist who described seeing the first 4 Red Army soldiers approach the fences. Quote, "They did not greet us, nor did they smile. They seemed oppressed, not only by compassion, but by confused restraint, which sealed their lips and bound their eyes to the funereal scene. It was that shame we knew so well, the shame that drowned us after the selections, and every time we had to watch, or to submit to, some outrage, the shame the Germans did not know, that the just man experiences at another man's crime. The feeling of guilt that such a crime should exist, that it should have been introduced irrevocably into the world of things that exist, and that his will for good should have proved too weak or null, and should not have availed in defense." End quote from Primo Levi's The Drowned and the Saved. As mentioned, German civilians were also evacuating far ahead of the surging Red Army as they could. And not only Germans, so were Estonians, Latvians, Lithuanians, even Poles and Ukrainians, who did not look forward to life under communism. Let's sum up the situation on the Eastern Front at the end of January 1945. In the north, in East Prussia, the Germans are trapped in 3 pockets against the Baltic Sea. The Heiligengebirge pocket at the Vistula Lagoon, at the western end of which is Danzig or Gdansk, 15 divisions. Konigsberg, where the remains of the 3rd Panzer Army and the 4th Army in the siege of Konigsberg. And the Samland Peninsula, that thumb of land north and west of Konigsberg. To quote from Evan Maudsley's Thunder in the East, the Nazi-Soviet War 1941 to 1945, the Russians claim to have completely destroyed some 35 German divisions in the Vistula Oder operation. Total Soviet losses in Poland were taken to be 600,000, although this probably takes into account all battles fought within the borders of the post-war Polish state, including German Pomerania, German Silesia, and parts of East Prussia. The combined Soviet losses in the Lvov-Sandomierz, Lublin-Brest, and Vistula Oder operations were less than this, perhaps about 150,000 all told. This was still a figure equal to half of American or British deaths total in the Second World War. End quote. I'll end with a description of the fate of civilians on the Eastern Front from Antony Beevor's The Second World War. Leonid Rabachev, a single lieutenant with the 31st Army, described the scenes beyond Goldap. Quote, "All the roads were filled with old people, women and children, large families moving slowly on carts, on vehicles, or on foot toward the west. Our tank troops, infantry, artillery, signals caught up with them and cleared the way for themselves by pushing their horses and carts and belongings into the ditches on either side of the road. Then thousands of them forced the old women and children aside. Forgetting their honor and duty and forgetting about the retreating German units, they pounced on the women and girls. Women, mothers, and their daughters lie to the right and left of the highway, and in front of each one stands a laughing gang of men with their trousers down. Those already covered in blood and losing consciousness are dragged to the side. Children trying to help them have been shot. There is laughter and roaring and jeering, screams and moans, and the soldiers' commanders, majors and lieutenant colonels, are standing there on the highway. Some are laughing, but some are also conducting the event so that all their soldiers, without exception, could take part. This is not an initiation rite, and it has nothing to do with revenge against the accursed occupiers. This is just hellish, diabolical group sex. This represents a complete lack of control and the brutal logic of a crowd gone mad. I was sitting in the cabin of our 1.5-ton truck, shaken, while my driver Demidov was standing in one of the queues. I was thinking of Flaubert's Carthage. The colonel, who had only just been conducting proceedings, could not resist the temptation and joined one of the queues, while the major was shooting the witnesses, the children and old men who were having hysterics. End quote. So much for the glory and the romance of war. Next episode. In 1945, the war in Europe was clearly in a different phase than it had been even in 1944. The end was in sight, although, as I have said, no one there at the time could know for certain exactly when the end would arrive. But the Allies were making plans for the end. On 30 January, UK Prime Minister Winston Churchill arrived in Malta in the Mediterranean to meet with US combined Chiefs of Staff and the British Chiefs of Staff. The purpose? To plan the final military campaign to defeat Germany. US President Roosevelt, recently sworn in for the 4th consecutive time, arrived on 2nd February. Then the next day, Churchill and Roosevelt boarded planes to fly to Yalta in Crimea for a conference with Joseph Stalin. And that's what we'll talk about next episode. Talk to you again in February. Until then, thank you once again for listening to Beyond Barbarossa, the podcast about the Eastern Front of the Second World War. As always, you can find maps and photos on the website for this episode, beyondbarbarossa.ca or beyondbarbarossa.podbean.com. Click or tap on the title for this episode. Clicking on the image will start a player for the episode you just heard. If you want to listen again, that's fine with me. I'm happy that you will do that. You can also listen to the episode on my own website, writtenword.ca. Just click on the podcast button in the banner. Thanks to all who have supported the podcast through Patreon. It goes a long way, not only to ensuring this podcast can continue to describe the Eastern Front, but also to helping others affected by war. You too can become a supporter. Just go to patreon.com/beyondbarbarossa and choose whatever level of support you wish. Also, please follow Beyond Barbarossa on your preferred podcasting app. If you have a couple of minutes, a rating on whichever podcasting app you use would help let other people interested in history know that Beyond Barbarossa is ready for them. Do you have something to add, a comment, question, or correction? I'd love to hear from you. Reach me by email at scott@beyondbarbarossa.ca or through the Facebook Beyond Barbarossa page. It's also easy to find me on Blue Sky and Instagram. Original music was composed and recorded by Nicholas Burry. Morse code sound effects by Thane Brown. I'm Scott Burry. Until next time, keep your paddles in the water. Slava Ukraina. Viva le Canada.